Okay, so let's place ourselves in the Virginia colony during the decades of the 1600s, before Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion happened in 1676, and if you recall, it was rebellion based on social class tensions between the haves and have-nots. You see this coalition form between the poor white indentured servants and the poor black slaves. Why? Because, they share this perceived commonality that united them in terms of oppression being visited upon them from, the elite of Virginia. Now, this rebellion, by the way, reminds us that Virginia was still not yet a slave society. Rather, it was a society with slaves. Why? Because Bacon's rebellion, in principle, could not happen, is inconceivable if Virginia happened to be a society with slaves at the time. Why? Well, we discussed the reasons, but if you recall, a slave society is defined by a rigid racial hierarchy. And, keyword there is, of course, racial. And when you say rigid, it means that the African Americans, who are slaves, are found in the lowest rungs of that society, and they cannot escape it, right? There's no such thing as moving beyond that station in life, determined by the fact that it's a slave society. So, it's race-based to the point where all persons of black skin, right, are identified as slaves. The two are synonymous, right? The two um, ideas of slavery and race. Okay, so what we're going to see here and what we're going to discuss is this process whereby Virginia transitions from a slave society, or you could even call it a servant society, right? Because 80% of the population in Virginia during most of the 1600s was comprised of English indentured servants. But that will change. It will transition towards it being a slave society. So if you notice the title of the slide, it describes it as a legal evolution. And that's exactly what it is. What you'll see are various laws, various statutes that emerge in Virginia, one by one. And eventually you'll see them compiled to the point where you see this overarching slave code emerge, which will almost make slavery kind of formal. It will formalize slavery, institutionalize it, redefine it as an actual slave society. So this is what we're going to discuss. And it's important to recognize that the law is behind this. What you see here is the law creating our social reality, rather than the law, say, reflecting the reality, right? No, it's the law creating reality. This kind of is similar to how race is a social construction. Here you're seeing how the law constructs reality, right? Okay, so if you take notice to the first line there, you see it as a process, and that's exactly what it is. It's an evolution, or also a process, right? Moving from litigation to statutes, and finally to, as I mentioned, slave codes. So what happens here, what this process involves, are individual cases that must be brought before the court, and then they're going to decide in an almost, I would say, arbitrary manner. They're sort of going to improvise. The lawmakers, that is, the jurists in the House of Burgesses of Virginia. Let's recall that the House of Burgesses is Virginia, the Virginia colonies, that is, a political and legal institution there. But the jurists within the House of Burgesses, will eventually have to deal with cases that involve African slaves, and it'll eventually evolve to the point where you'll see actual laws created that serve as precedents. Okay, so here is an important concept to understand in case you are unaware of what precedents are, especially in a legal sense. A precedent, by the way, this is spelled Precedents, and most of you have probably heard of this word. Whenever you hear the term unprecedented, right, it means something that hasn't been done. Well, a precedent is basically a model or a guide that serves as an example for future cases. And when you look at our legal system, it's basically based upon legal precedents. All right. The various laws that emerge, especially Supreme Court decisions, set the precedent that is for future cases that are similar in context in a legal sense. For example, you've heard of Roe versus Wade, right? Basically, when that was passed in the early 1970s by the Supreme Court, it was the law of the land. It became the law of the land, which pronounced that no state laws in the United States of America can issue laws, or no states can issue laws, that prohibit or outlaw abortion. All right, so that established the precedent regarding the legal issue, again, in the legal sense, of abortion, whether it's illegal or not. All right, so ever since then, it established the precedent regarding cases involving abortion. And until that gets overturned, which is always a possibility by a future Supreme Court, in this case, Roe v. Wade serves as the precedent, and it can't be contested. All right, so what's going to happen in Virginia is the formation of laws that become precedents, right? That is to say, examples for future cases involving slavery. Okay, so let's start from the beginning of this process. And it's described there as litigation being the first phase. What does this mean? And again, I kind of hinted at this earlier, but what's going to happen in Virginia is this. Well, first of all, let's recall that the first persons of African descent who would arrive as slaves in Jamestown would be 1619. And it's going to be a small, migratory stream at first, just a handful. And then, more and more African slaves will come over. But again, I just mentioned this, 80% of the population until well into the 1600s would be white indentured servants, not black slaves. In fact, that is the transition that we're exactly, describing here, right? How do you go from indentured servants to black slaves being the primary labor force? Okay, so with eventually the steady stream of African slaves coming into the colony, it's invariably the case that you will require some sort of litigation, or to put it more precise, cases that require some sort of litigation will arise before the House of Burgesses, okay, for them to decide upon. Why is this the case? Because there are no slave laws very beginning in Virginia. Why is this the case? Well, there's no slave laws in England, the mother country, that they could bring over. And, secondly, indentured servants technically are servants still, even though they may be treated like slaves. And to be frank, quite often they were, right? It still was not let's say, quote, pure slavery, meaning that, it was contractual. It was understood that both parties involved are, voluntarily entering this contractual agreement, right? The servant agrees to put himself in the state of servitude, right? And more importantly, probably, the length of the tenure regarding servitude was hardly, perpetual. It was actually, 4 to 5 years, maybe 8 years. So it was, relatively short, if you will. So what happens is that masters tended to treat their African slaves similar to that of their indentured servants. Why? Because, again, there's no laws around, no formal, if you will, decorum on how to treat them, right? There's no precedent, to use our term, on, how to treat them. Are they slaves from, beginning of life to the end of life? Not necessarily. Some masters may think that way, but some won't. Some will say, well, I freed my indentured servant after 8 years. I'll do the same with my African slaves, right? So it was sort of improvised in the beginning in terms of masters, right? How they treated their slaves. And also it was sort of improvised by the jurist whenever some sort of litigation arose regarding their African slaves. What do we mean by litigation involving African slaves in the absence of slave laws? Here's an example. Let's say in early Virginia, before slave laws, you had cases whereby an English master who had a slave of African descent, he suddenly died. So what is the status of that slave if there are no slave laws, right? Is the slave now free? Should the slave, on the other hand, go to the closest relative, right? Is the slave still a property? Well, that's obviously not clear-cut in a legal sense. So what you have happening in the beginning, as I explained it, was sort of improvisatory, meaning they improvise. A jurist may say this, in light of the fact that Mr. Smith, the owner, the master of the African slave, let's say his name is William, Mr. Smith died suddenly, has no relatives or anything. Therefore, William, I declare, is a free man, right? But then you could imagine this. Maybe the next case would involve a jurist that, decides otherwise. He may decide that the slave must go to the son, for example, right? All right, so no clear-cut way of dealing with particular or specific context involving African slaves. Here's another case that I'm sure arose, right? A case whereby a master sexually exploited his African slave woman, and then they bore a child, right? So how do you determine the status of that child given that there's no slave laws to do that? Well, a jurist might say, in fact, he might even say this child looks white. I say this child is free, right? They might base it on skin color. Who knows, right? So again, it's not clear cut, so you sort of improvise. So this is what I mean by individual cases of litigation that emerges before the court involving African slaves, right? It's basically a case-by-case sort of situation in a legal sense. But what happens is the eventual emergence of laws, otherwise called statutes, that actually do establish precedent regarding how to treat slaves in that particular context. For example, from now on, a slave law might say, in all future cases, the slave must pass on as property to the next relative, right? Okay, so statutes, that middle part of this evolution, is the crucial part, because once you have a significant number of statutes, you could start forming, the slave codes, right? You could start codifying all together, all these laws put together, and setting up this overarching slave code again. All right, but let's discuss some crucial statutes that happen here that, moreover, deal squarely with this notion of racialized slavery. Okay, and again, racialized slavery is that connection with, in this case, black skin and natural slavery, to the point where they become one and the same thing. All right, so there's that question, right? How do you get slaves of African descent to become your primary labor force, right? Actually, when we think about this, this deserves some discussion here. In the beginning, of course, they counted on indentured servants from England as a primary labor force, but you could easily imagine why that's not reliable entirely. And I mentioned one particular reason is that their contract expired eventually. And moreover, once they were free from indentured servitude, it's more likely the case that they would want to seek their own land. They don't want to work on someone else's land. In fact, this is actual occurrence here that happened back then. Many indentured servants went on to migrate to Pennsylvania. Why? Well, let's recall that even William Penn himself, the founder of Pennsylvania, described his colony as, quote, the best poor man's country in the world, unquote. So they were not exactly, motivated to stay in Virginia. They actually want to do the opposite. They want to migrate away from it in search of their own land and in the determination to achieve their own mobility in the new world. So you can't exactly rely on indentured servants. What about natives, Indians? Well, no. And by the way, this did happen for a while. Virginia, that is. The planters tried to enslave Indians, but it never worked. Why? Because often the native would abscond eventually from the plantation. He would take off, basically, and it's the Indians who knew the land, not the Virginia colonials, right? Especially in the frontier, quote, unsettled area. And moreover, they risked retaliation. Massacres did happen because some escaped slaves went back and word got around to the Indian tribe of what happened, and they would retaliate. So you can't depend on Indians. Can you depend on the elites doing the labor? No. Okay, obviously. So here we see the turn towards African labor as a solution. And that's economic. Let's also remember the political context of Bacon's Rebellion, right? It was dangerous now after Bacon's Rebellion. Well, even before Bacon's Rebellion, they feared in Virginia, they feared the possibility of, an uprise because they knew they were vastly outnumbered. And even later on in the history of the United States, say during the 1800s, in certain parts of the South, in the southern states, where slaves significantly outnumbered the whites in that population. For example, Carolina, South Carolina, slaves outnumbered whites 2/3 to 1/3. So there's always that looming possibility of slave revolt, right? So this was the case in a political sense, right, in the Virginia colony, and it became a reality with Bacon's Rebellion. So, that's problematic itself, right? Okay, so what we're going to do is, in the next slide, we're going to talk about, or the next video actually, we're going to talk about two particular statutes that emerged that really calcify this idea of racial slavery. It actually works tremendously in the service of connecting black skin and natural slavery in the ideological world of Virginia. And of course, this will eventually materialize as actual practice until, again, the Civil War's end.